In the 120 years since its extraordinary power was first harnessed, electricity has changed the destiny of mankind. As supple as it is strong, this life-giving energy has urged on our deep instinct for innovation. And now, after 12 decades of highly charged progress, almost no aspect of life remains untouched. Our factories, our cities, our homes, our planes, trains, and communication, all the major pillars of our civilization, transformed beyond recognition, all except one notable exception. Motorbikes, cars, vans, buses, and trucks all beat to the drum of the internal combustion engine. But after over 100 smoggy years, experts are asking questions. How did this happen? Is this long, noisy road party about to end? Are we really ready for change? Is it time for the electric revolution? In the 21st century, the romantic dream of the open road has come to something of a dead end. Driving in the world's great cities is now a painful experience. Tempers often running as hot as the car's engines. All the while frittering away one of the Earth's most valuable and unrenewable sources of energy, our oil. It's pretty clear the need for an alternative to the internal combustion engine has never been greater. New York suffers like any other modern city, its congested streets coughing fumes all through the day and long into the night. But take a trip across Brooklyn Bridge into this urban oasis, and it's possible to take a peek at what could be one solution.
It's an ideal car to drive around anywhere, in my opinion. It's no fumes, it's beautiful, it's nice and smooth, fast pickup, and get all of our power from the sun. Can't get any better than that.
It's not simply that all the service vehicles driven by Brooklyn Bridge Park's Rangers are electric. EVs, or electric vehicles, are nothing new. What is unusual is that they recharge their batteries at an on-site charging station that takes all its power directly from the sun. It's a system that keeps air quality up and costs down.
By using solar-powered electric vehicles in our parks, we're saving over $200,000 in gas prices, tens of thousands of dollars in electricity costs, over 550 tons of CO2 will be saved. So they're pretty significant savings.
The almost non-existent environmental impact of this park's EVs is seen as a template for similar projects in the future and is an area in which New York is blazing a trail.
New York is a microcosm of the entire world, and I think this is the best place for it to happen right now.
New York City has been at the fulcrum of a new electric age once before when, in the 1890s, newly available domestic electricity was having a profound impact on its better-off residents.
The end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s was an incredibly interesting period for consumers to see the role of electricity. Electricity went from being a curiosity in the late 1800s to being an essential part of everyday life by the early 1900s. We saw electrification of homes, electric lights, electric appliances, electric recording eventually, and so many ways in which electricity was changing the lives of people.
The transforming experience for people who'd lived with oil lamps and candles, you know, particularly in the home, then suddenly when it was possible to have electric light, that you literally walked into a room, you didn't need matches, you just flicked a big Bakelite switch on the wall and light came on, and it didn't burn anything and it didn't smell and it didn't fill the room with smoke, and, you know, it must have been, it's very hard for us to imagine now, the transforming experience that must have been. And that whole movement of that time was about modernity and the future, and You know, there was a lot of science fiction written at that time, and people saw into the future and went, God, this is going to be amazing. We're going to live in a completely different world. And electricity was absolutely at the core of that.
Just as electricity was transforming life in the home, so it was also about to revolutionize life on the road. By 1898, thanks to the scientists who spent the last 50 years gradually improving batteries and electric motors, it really was possible for a capable engineer to go into car production using electric power.
There were tens of thousands of people who saw the idea of a car and said, wait, engine or electric motor, 3 or 4 wheels, I could do that in the barn. And history tends really just to record the ones who make a big splash, or the ones who do something so amazing or so unusual looking or so crazy that people notice them.
And what better way to make a splash than by setting the land speed record in your very own electric car? Belgian businessman Camille Janazzi was building electric taxis for Paris. To generate publicity for his company, he took up the challenge laid down by Comte Gaston de Chasseloup-Laubat, who'd already set the land speed record in March 1899, driving his electric car at the unheard-of velocity of nearly 93 kilometers per hour. Janazzi's response was to create his own electric-powered speedster.
Donc Camille Janazzi était vraiment un fanat du sport automobile, et il avait conduit des tas d'autres voitures avant, mais il voulait absolument arriver à battre tous les records de vitesse. Et c'est ainsi qu'il a pensé à faire la Jamais Contente.
Rather than a reference to his own competitive streak, calling his car the Never Content was actually Janazzi's attempt to improve the atmosphere at home.
Sa femme n'était jamais contente, il n'avait jamais de parole, il rentrait à n'importe quelle heure du jour ou de la nuit, il rentrait même pas. Et bien entendu, comme lui avait un petit peu un caractère pointu aussi, ça faisait des étincelles. Et puis il a appelé sa femme la Jamais Contente. Et quand il a vu que sa voiture, ça marchait bien, il a appelé sa voiture la Jamais Contente, en l'honneur de sa femme d'ailleurs qu'il aimait beaucoup.
For several highly charged weeks, Janazzi and his Parisian rival traded the record back and forth until on the 29th of April, 1899, Janazzi piloted his high-voltage, bullet-shaped car to an unprecedented land speed record of 106 kilometers per hour.
Alors donc oui, c'est un record mondial absolu. Aucun véhicule n'avait réussi à rouler à cette vitesse absolument affolante pour l'époque. Ça a été quelque chose d'extraordinaire parce qu'on avait toujours peur, à cette époque-là, que dépasser 100 km à l'heure, on pouvait en mourir. Or, ça ne s'est pas passé du tout comme ça.
That original car still exists locked away in the dusty vaults of a museum. But wanting to see history come alive again, Monsieur Wonnard set about building a replica of the 1899 record breaker, although it should be noted that its batteries and motors are of a much more recent vintage.
Faire la réplique était un travail énorme parce qu'il n'existait strictement plus aucun plan, aucune donnée, rien du tout. Nous avons été dans l'obligation de consulter la véritable Jamais Contente au musée de Compiègne, de prendre les mesures, de prendre tout ce qui était nécessaire à la remise en état de marche d'une nouvelle Jamais Contente. Cette voiture fonctionne avec des batteries spéciales pour les véhicules électriques, c'est-à-dire beaucoup plus solides, beaucoup plus shadés. Et vous avez donc 2 moteurs là, qui délivre 68 kW pour le fonctionnement des moteurs. Et vous avez donc des pneumatiques de chez Michelin qui sont, eux, comme dit précédemment, indéjantables. Alors la Jamais Contente est très facile à manœuvrer. Avec ce que l'on appelle des manches à gigot, vous pouvez la manœuvrer, mais alors, comme une voiture d'enfant, En mon expérience de conduite de la jamais contente, c'est extraordinaire parce que jamais je ne me serais attendu à une facilité de conduite aussi bonne et une tenue de route aussi parfaite que cette voiture-là. C'est vraiment extraordinaire. J'ai jamais eu de cabriolet décapotable, mais alors là, au moins, j'en ai un. Hein.
With exploits such as La Jamais Content's speed record, the upwardly mobile classes of Europe were becoming switched on to electric vehicles. However, it was across the Atlantic in the buzzing metropolis of New York that early EVs were really taking off. Manufacturers were popping up everywhere, and cars such as the Baker and Detroit Electric were duking it out with all comers on the tough streets of Manhattan.
New York streets had pretty much everything on them, and they were a mess. You had an enormous system of trams, streetcars. You had horses pulling carriages. You had horses pulling carts and trucks and wagons full of stuff. And then you had this new arrival of cars and trucks. And they were split pretty evenly between steam cars, electric cars, and gasoline engine cars.
In this transitional era, around 1905, EVs were rapidly establishing themselves as a reliable and easy way to get around the city, in distinct contrast to the alternatives of the day.
Steam cars were great. They were smooth and powerful. It just took 45 minutes between the time that you lit the fire and the point where you had enough steam to propel the steam engine to make the car go. Taking 45 minutes to start your vehicle, not necessarily all that practical. It's important to remember that the gasoline engine cars of, say, 1900 sounded like motorcycles with no exhaust pipes at all. They were really loud, they backfired frequently, which often caused the horse next to them to jump up or rear, which made all of the people who were using horse-powered vehicles really annoyed, and they put out incredible amounts of pollution. To start it, you had to turn a crank to crank the engine, and quite frequently, that crank would kick back, and if you were lucky, it would just bruise you. If you weren't so lucky, it would break your thumb, and occasionally it broke your arm. Electric cars were considered the nicest, most civilized, and smoothest way because the power came right away if your battery was charged, which you could do overnight. They were quiet, and they were smooth. They didn't make all this noise.
The electric car had already reached a fairly highly evolved stage where it had 40 or 50 miles of range, you know, it didn't have to be cranked, it was really quiet, it didn't emit any foul smells or anything, and women gravitated to them very early on.
If you think about how women were dressed back then, and you've seen the pictures, massive layers of clothes, down to the ground, et cetera, especially nicer upper income women, better bred women. Think about the physical effort it took either to stoke a boiler or to crank an engine. It wasn't sort of perceived that that was a good thing for women to do. Electric cars, open the door, get in, sit down, press the button, and motor quietly away. That was a civilized way for women to travel.
But it wasn't just well-off ladies who could see that EVs were the way to go.
This car was my great-grandfather's, and it's, 104 years old, and to be able to drive that on the road is pretty cool.
This Baker Electric was first owned by E.W. Rice, one of the many early adopters of this exciting new technology.
We steer with this tiller that's I'm using my right hand on, and then the gear shift is over on my left hand here. It's a lot simpler to drive than a car of today, that's for sure, and there are no radios or GPSs to confuse you.
Now passed on to his great-grandson Wilbur Rice, this trailblazing EV has become a treasured family heirloom.
This car for my great-grandfather was a special vehicle, and I suspect it was a fairly expensive car at the time. And he used it to be chauffeured back and forth to work, and for my great-grandmother to be taken down to town with. It's not a car that everybody could have.
As with all cars at the time, the hefty price tag tended to ensure exclusivity. But it was still no guarantee of a smooth ride.
We're going across some bumpy spots right now, and that is a little disconcerting when you hit the potholes on a dirt road. It's causing the steering spring to let the steering oscillate a little bit more. But I guess that's okay. You can have a spring that's worn out after 104 years, right?
At their peak in 1912, electric vehicles accounted for over a third of all cars in the USA. However, while just a ticket for short, slow journeys around town, their 30 or 40-mile range found them wanting on the open roads.
Electric cars had a lot of pros. They were smooth, they just motored away, they were usable for women at the time, but they also had some cons. For one thing, they had short range. They didn't have the top speed that gasoline cars or even steam cars could reach. And as the road network in North America and in Europe expanded and people could go, in this country, into the frontier and sort of spread out, what we would now call suburbs, electric cars were perceived mostly as urban vehicles.
Already struggling with limited range, a rather ironic innovation was about to put paid to one of the electric car's main advantages.
So one of the biggest factors in the demise of the electric car was, strangely enough, due to electric motors. It was an engineer and scientist called Charles F. Kettering reduced the size of an electric motor, made it very small, and used it to start petrol engines.
That tamed the gas engine. All of a sudden, instead of having to crank and maybe get something broken, you could press a button. All you had to do was carry one battery on your car and this little motor on the side. So all of a sudden, gasoline cars became practical for, among other people, women.
Not only was gasoline now a practical fuel to use, it was also becoming cheaper. Most crucially of all, however, a man called Henry Ford was about to transform car making and motoring itself.
Once Henry Ford created the Model T, priced it so that it was affordable to the common man, and then essentially built this gigantic manufacturing complex to crank out millions of Model Ts, the die was pretty much cast. The Model T was the car that put America and really the world on wheels. He ended up making over 20 million of them, and there was a time in the world when a quarter of all of the cars were Model Ts.
In 1912, a Model T sold for about a third as much as a typical EV, and the prices just kept on coming down. With advances in battery technology failing to materialize, it seemed the electric car had run out of juice. The age of the internal combustion engine had begun. With production of domestic electric vehicles petering out in the mid-1920s, and with recovery from World War II re-energizing Western economies, by the 1960s, oil was well and truly the king of fuels.
Enormous reserves of oil were found all over the world, and the technology to extract that was developed and improved and became very efficient. And so we started to extract billions of barrels of oil every day, and we could transport it. We had the infrastructure to support that, and the big oil refineries were built and the petrol stations. So it just became an incredibly cheap source of abundant energy. There was no motivation to do anything else.
If it cost $6 to fill up your car, I mean, people didn't really worry about, saving 40 cents or, saving some more money, especially if you were going to pay more to buy the car in the first place. And electric cars were historically more expensive.
With cheap oil flooding the market, there was little appetite for EV technology, and battery power was sidelined to the golf course. Besides, the Western world, and America in particular, had fallen head over heels in love with big, thirsty gas guzzlers.
The noise of cars and their technical complexity turned out to be a positive and not a negative. The idea of going vroom, vroom, vroom was appealing to people, particularly men, and it was seen as working on fixing your car, speeding off and making a big noise. That was seen as a masculine thing to do, whereas an electric car was seen as being somehow feminine.
If the 1960s were the golden years of motoring, the 70s would turn out to be a bitter taste of things to come. By now, the roads of the world's great economies were nose to tail, cars, buses, and trucks. Almost every one burning through its fuel like there was no tomorrow. tomorrow did come, and American oil was drying up. The US now relied on Middle Eastern imports. Then, in '73, war broke out between Israel and its neighbors. The US had backed Israel. The Arabs turned off the oil taps, and all hell broke loose on the forecourts.
It had an enormous impact. I mean, it was a devastating shock to the global economy, particularly to the United States, who up until that point, petrol was so close to free. It wasn't true. So they developed huge vehicles with enormous engines and very, by today's standards, appallingly low fuel efficiency. I mean, you're looking at family cars that did 6 or 7 miles to the gallon. I mean, they were absolutely bonkers. And that shock really sent a shockwave through the whole world.
I remember sort of gasoline lines. I remember this shocking notion that, in fact, gasoline did not flow like water, that actually you might have to wait, that in some places, actually, if your license plate was even, you only got to buy gasoline on even days. If your license plate was odd, you went on odd days. This was completely foreign to the experience of the auto industry.
The high fuel prices of the mid-'70s were enough to rekindle the long-dormant idea of using electricity to power cars. But after 50 years in the development doldrums, there was a lot of catching up to do.
You had companies like General Electric develop a number of electric vehicle prototypes, and they were in the electric business, so you could see why they had a stake in that. And I think they put out some fairly credible ones, but they were never an attempt to manufacture them.
They were legitimate research efforts. They put a lot of time into them, engineering resources. But the problem with all of them is that they were still handicapped by the same stuff that handicapped electric cars in the 20s.
While the big car companies dithered, that familiar bugbear of battery performance wasn't about to deter Robert G. Beaumont, the man behind the Sebring City Car.
A two-seat, very sort of geometrically shaped little commuter car. Didn't go very fast, didn't have a great range, but it was a new concept for a couple of generations after the electric cars of the 20s, and they actually sold 2,500 of them. It was, for quite a while, the world's best-selling electric car in 50 years.
It was 1974, and Beaumont had seen that small EVs could fill a pretty big niche, providing a cheap alternative for the short journeys taken by commuters. But after some early success, the initial demand fizzled out.
I'm your basic American consumer. I don't want to spend that much money on gasoline. I would consider an electric car, as long as it will do all the same stuff that my gasoline car will do. The Sebring City Car didn't do any of those things, so it was always going to be a very, very niche vehicle. And frankly, the looks, I mean, people would stop and stare, probably didn't help it. It didn't look like a real car.
And it had a really limited, like, 40-mile range, and you'd have to be a real enthusiast to really find what it offered acceptable.
Let's see if we can get her to run now. Doubt it, but we will try. Nah.
City car collector Peter Crescitello is one of the very small group of people who have been seduced by the quirky appeal of this crude 70s EV.
I'm sort of the patron saint of lost causes, and this car in particular was a lost cause to begin with. It's been a garage queen all of its life. I found it in Pennsylvania at the summer cottage of a New York resident, behind the bushes, buried up to its hubcaps in the weeds. And it's taken me 6 years to get it in this condition here, and I hope to get it on the road shortly.
Peter's pride and joy, a 1977 Model A, often requires some judicious tinkering before movement is possible.
It's been a constant love-hate relationship with this car since I got it. Trying to get it to run, it almost running, and then not running. Not going. Okay, we got... Up to the present, I've had this car on the road, driving under its own power for a whopping total of 1 whole mile before I had to have it towed back home again. Come on, get out there. I'm hoping eventually to get the things worked out to actually get it to drive daily as my commuter around town. Some of the people I've questioned stated it was a great dating car because it was a two-seater, close contact, and it didn't have a very good range, so you couldn't go very far. Yeah, these batteries are just about drained. Oh well, gets me here and there occasionally. Now we can push it back in the driveway.
While it's perhaps unlikely that there are too many city car babies out there, what is certain is that the car's poor quality and, more importantly, the return of cheaper oil put paid to the mini EV renaissance of the 1970s. By the mid-80s, as economies began to flourish, it was back to business as usual for the internal combustion engine. More and bigger cars burning ever more fuel, producing ever more pollution. It was a situation that, in California, would lead to the electric revolution's most controversial moment. By 1990, car use in Los Angeles had created a crisis. Despite already tight regulations, exhaust emissions were having a massive impact on the quality of life in this vast urban city.
The pollution levels in central Los Angeles were really shocking. It was the combination of the sun, the heat, the lack of wind, the fact that the air was trapped there, so that you would get literally dark grey skies in the middle of the summer that were nothing to do with clouds or rain. They were just to do with the pollution from the cars.
Impressed by the promise of a prototype EV from General Motors, the local environmental regulators saw a potential solution.
So they passed legislation which said that every vehicle manufacturer that sold cars in California had to produce, as part of their range, zero emissions vehicles, cars that didn't pump anything out of their exhaust pipe.
GM were in a good position to respond and launched the GM EV1.
It was a great car, very high-tech, nice acceleration, smooth, quiet.
But the EV1s were not for sale. Each one was leased to users, and only about 800 were eventually distributed. However, those who did get hold of them often became vociferous EV advocates.
They became very popular cars, and they became a sort of little cult. And all the time in the background, General Motors, the oil companies, all the other motor manufacturers were lobbying the Californian government to get this law repealed because it was holding back their business. They couldn't sell the cars they wanted to in California, which is one of the biggest markets in the world.
The big car makers got their way and GM cancelled the whole electric car project. The trouble was, many EV1 drivers didn't want to play ball.
When GM said, right, your lease is up, give us back your car, come on, give back the car now. A lot of these folks who were used to having things their way really got upset and said, I don't want to give back my car, it's a great car. GM took them back anyway, and the controversy arose because the company was particularly inept in the way it went about them. Despite sort of protests, it more or less seized the cars and took them away, and then it got filmed crushing them.
Despite its premature demise, the GM EV1 had shown there was an appetite for electric vehicles. For European car makers, high fuel taxation had always encouraged more economical engines such as turbo diesels. But in the research laboratories of Renault, EV technology had long been explored as an alternative. Renault tried fitting batteries and motors to both the Quattro and the 5 in the 1970s, though without any tangible success. However, the result of an R&D program during the 1990s was a range of prototype vehicles with more promise. Most often, they were adapted from successful models such as the Clio and the Kangoo. Most notably, though, Renault also went back to the drawing board with entirely new EV concepts, such as the compact and urban Zoom in 1992, and, in 1996, a 5-door family car called Next. Despite this effort, the familiar headwinds of limited range and the lack of investment in infrastructure meant they were forced to shelve their EV project. Nevertheless, invaluable experience and knowledge had been gathered. Knowledge that would mean Renault were ready when the time was right. What projects such as Renault Zoom had shown was that the sheer simplicity of EV engineering was hugely empowering for free-thinking designers. Now at the start of the 21st century, anyone making their very own one-off EVs really could rip up the rulebook.
Ah, ça roule, c'est du tonnerre. Ça me plaît.
Coqueline Courrèges is world famous, but not for her hot rod EVs. For the last 50 years, her couture house has been at the top of the fashion industry. She was one of the driving forces of the 60s, famous for inventing the miniskirt and the go-go boot. In 1969, alarmed by rising fuel prices, she created her very first EV prototype and showcased it on the catwalk.
C'était non pas le désir de faire du design, non, c'était le fait de soulever l'énorme problème qui se présentait déjà en 68 de l'énergie. L'essence, où va-t-on, que fait-on? Donc, où va-t-on, que fait-on? La réponse est, on ne parle pas chez Courrèges, on propose. Donc, déjà, il y a une petite voiture avec une batterie, et à ce moment-là, elle est au plomb. Et on montre à la presse qu'il y a un sujet important dans le monde entier qu'il faudrait peut-être se mettre en route pour le traduire. Ce n'est pas une volonté de designer de faire un dessin de voiture, c'est traduire un sujet énorme. Voilà.
After that first little car, Madame Courrèges carried on building her own EV one-offs, but these were not garden shed DIY jobs. Using the best technology, the designer has since made 6 prototypes, 3 of which are kept at her home in Paris. The bubble she created in 2002.
Celle-là, elle m'a tout appris. J'ai fait toutes mes erreurs sur elle. C'est la plus gentille de toutes les voitures.
In 2004, the XE was born.
Elle m'apporte les erreurs et la décision. Ah, il faudrait mieux faire ça, il faudrait mieux faire ça.
And her 2006 creation, La Zoop.
Elle est très intéressante. J'ai supprimé les portières, j'ai supprimé les essuie-glaces, Bon, il y a quand même de quoi envelopper, mais techniquement, cette forme était très difficile à faire. Donc, au lieu de m'encombrer avec des petits détails des anciennes carrosseries, je préfère faire ça. C'est plus dur à faire et ça va mieux. Vous savez, c'est très dur de faire une petite robe blanche Courrèges avec des manches courtes très simples. C'est très dur de faire ces voitures très simples. Que ce soit les piétons ou les voitures, la réaction des deux est toujours un sourire et un pouce levé. Souvent, les gens m'ont fait même un geste, est-ce qu'il décolle en l'air comme un hélicoptère? Ça veut dire que déjà, ce côté-là, il est passionnant de voir le sourire des gens. Ça, c'est merveilleux.
While Madame Courrèges had always been convinced by electrical power, since the late 1990s, a Japanese car had been quietly convincing the skeptical majority that there were big advantages to EV technology. It was called the Prius.
Toyota had decided to make a high-mileage car as a technology statement, and when they introduced the second generation in 2004, it was right on an upsurge in gas prices.
So it had a small petrol engine and an electric motor, and its emissions coming out of its exhaust are very, very low. Still to this day, the lowest of any petrol car on the road. That caught on, and the Prius caught on in a big way.
All of a sudden, people could buy a car at Toyota, which was thought to be reliable, that gave them this amazingly high gas mileage and required no compromises. You still treated it like a regular car. You could still drive it across the country, fill it up with gas, just a lot less gas, less often.
Marrying gasoline to electricity to create a hybrid was nothing new, but the success of the Prius was not just the result of solid engineering. The Japanese company showed real belief in hybrid technology by selling each car at a loss.
It was subsidized at the time by Toyota. I think that was a very canny move. They realized it would take a while to develop a market. And they also realized that to price the Prius too high would mean very few people would market it. You could look at what the big three were doing, the American companies, Ford, Chrysler, and GM. They had also developed hybrid cars as part of a government-subsidized program. And they could have been on the market in 2000 with hybrids too, but they didn't see the market, and the idea of subsidizing the cars would never have occurred to them.
Sales of the Prius continued to grow, passing the 2 million mark in 2010, sending a clear message to both buyers and makers of cars that change was in the wind.
The Toyota Prius proved to the world's auto industry that, in fact, there was some demand for high-mileage cars as long as they did whatever any other car did.
What the Prius did was open the door to alternatives to a straight petrol engine.
There's absolutely no doubt that the success of the Prius in particular, and of hybrid technologies, it sort of paved the way for a wider consumer acceptance of electric cars.
While the Prius had convinced many ordinary drivers of the benefits of electric motors, those looking for performance saw no need to get excited. That was until 2008, when they set eyes on the Tesla.
When the EV Roadster came out, it really raised the bar on what you could expect from an electric car. It was this very sexy sports car. It's a version of a Lotus, very, very fun to drive.
Let me tell you, it is an incredible blast to drive.
Right off the bat, it knocked two of the things that I figured about electric cars based on everything I'd heard, that they couldn't handle well, and that they'd be slow and boring, and that pretty much you might as well just kill yourself. That I realized, you know, total bullshit.
Amazing performance, well over 100 miles of range, 200 if you don't use the performance.
And everyone else says 100 miles. So that right there really changed the game.
It was basically the first electric supercar.
So, a tiny company had proved EVs were ready for a comeback. Surely it was time for the major manufacturers to show their mettle. But who would it be? The start of the 21st century is very different to the start of the 20th. Oil is no longer the abundant, dark elixir powering people in their cars. Today, oil is ever more valuable and ever more scarce. In our efforts to eke out what's left, combustion engines continue to evolve. But surely the next great step is for us to break free of this noisy, polluting millstone once and for all. However, while many manufacturers are making big noises about variations of hybrid technology in small production runs, only a few companies are committing to making completely electric vehicles. Several Japanese car manufacturers continue to blaze a trail, but it's a European company who is investing more than any other. Renault is launching 4 brand new fully electric cars that will form the world's first full range of EVs, starting with a car whose shape is familiar and practical.
Quand vous êtes deux, donc un véhicule utilitaire, là l'usage typique c'est les flottes. Et notamment, on pense beaucoup à des usages comme la poste ou les livraisons urbaines. L'avantage d'un postier, c'est qu'il fait tous les jours le même trajet. Donc avec un véhicule électrique, s'il est capable de le faire une fois, il le fait tous les jours.
The second Renault is a 4-door saloon, especially designed to address the problem of limited range.
Fluence Z2, c'est une grande berline familiale. On l'a principalement dessinée pour quelques marchés export, notamment le marché israélien, qui est un marché très important pour le véhicule électrique et où on a un partenariat avec une entreprise qui s'appelle Better Place qui mettra en place des stations d'échange de batteries.
Now being piloted in Israel and Denmark, the Better Place solution will offer a one-stop battery replacement infrastructure.
The idea of swappable batteries does address the range question, which is one of the critical problems with EVs. I've actually seen Better Place demonstrate its battery swapping technology, and in less than a minute, it can take a battery pack out of a car and replace it with a new one. The idea is that you would then be able to use an EV for long-distance travel, because you drive on the highway, when you got to the end of battery, you go in, and it would only take a minute, just like getting gas.
If the Fluence has a conventional shape, the third EV in Renault's new range throws away the rule book. Part scooter, part car, perhaps the best of both worlds.
Twizy, un petit véhicule 2 places, vraiment une alternative aux 2 roues. En fait, c'est 4 roues pour le prix de 2, un véhicule 2 places qui sera disponible avec et sans permis. Donc, y compris pour les adolescents de 16 ans, il y aura une version disponible.
You know, it's quite a big, brave step to make, because we're so used to big metal boxes, to get in a little steery thing that's sort of like a car, and it does look like something from science fiction. But, you know, if you're in a busy city, a brilliant way of getting around.
While it may only manage 80 kilometers per hour, the Twizy's handling, especially tuned for cities, is rewarding enough for even the most demanding of drivers.
Yeah, it's like a scooter, but, you know, something between a scooter and a car. So it's good fun, electric. You don't hear the engine, but it was quite powerful up here, so very direct. Seems good fun.
Et puis on terminera en 2012, mi-2012, par Zoé. Zoé, c'est vraiment l'équivalent d'une Clio. C'est la deuxième voiture de la famille. C'est celle que je vais pouvoir utiliser pour aller au travail, faire les courses, aller chercher mes enfants tous les jours. Donc c'est vraiment la voiture pratique au quotidien.
As well as maximizing these 4 new cars' range and power, Renault has also made sure that driving their EVs will be a serene experience.
Quand nous avons fait essayer les véhicules qui pouvaient inquiéter les conducteurs, c'est le fait que le véhicule très silencieux et donc la crainte de gêner ou de ne pas être repéré par des passants. Pour cela, nous développons un système de bruitage finalement du véhicule, puisque jusqu'à environ 30 km/h, le véhicule est parfaitement silencieux. Donc dans cette phase-là, particulièrement en ville, nous allons recréer un bruit, alors bien sûr pas le bruit d'un moteur thermique, et un bruit beaucoup moins gênant, beaucoup moins perturbant, disons, mais qui avertit les passants de l'arrivée d'un véhicule électrique.
It's attention to detail such as this that shows the commitment and belief Renault has for this resurgent technology.
Renault aujourd'hui a pris le pari, parce que ça s'appelle un pari, hein, ça s'appelle pas autrement. Renault a pris le pari de l'électrique, ce qui n'est pas forcément le cas d'autres constructeurs. Hein. Chaque constructeur a eu ses choix, mais Renault a fait celui-là.
I think it's very brave, and I certainly admire it, because it would be very easy for them to just produce a little electric vehicle that they show to a prime minister or a president somewhere and go, look what we've done, and they've jumped way beyond that. So they've gone right out of the leader of the pack in terms of automotive manufacturers, and started producing absolutely purpose-built electric vehicles, which they're pushing onto the market at a level where a large section of the population can afford them.
Today, we're at the place where, for the first time since the 1920s, real car manufacturers are making and selling real cars that plug into the wall and run on electricity. That hasn't happened for many, many decades, and it's kind of exciting.
Electric car on roads so dark to change the end.
Whoever makes the car, getting behind the wheel of a modern EV and experiencing all the positives they can offer soon tells its own story.
Electric car on verdant.
I certainly think driving an electric car is just somehow more relaxing than driving a manual gearbox petrol car. In a sense, it's much more like driving an automatic. There's nothing other than the throttle and the brakes to worry about with your feet. The steering, everything else works exactly the same. Well, the indicators, lights, steering, all that stuff. It's got a very impressive response, so you can drive very, very economically and carefully and not accelerate hard, and you'll get much greater range. But if you do need to overtake, then this car will start to move very fast. What a lot of people experience when they first go in an electric car is a slight feeling of alarm with the acceleration. It is, not only is it very firm acceleration, but there's no gear change. So it's very, very constant. So you're constantly accelerating. So effectively, this car is faster. than many, many petrol cars of the same size and design. You know, it actually will get you to a higher speed quicker because you're not having that little delay as you change gear all the time. So from that point of view, it's an extremely effective car. And I think it's those little things that people don't consider. Traffic jams is a perfect example. Electric cars are not going to get rid of traffic jams. Electric cars will sit in traffic jams. But when they're sitting there, nothing's coming out. And they're not wasting energy.
I drove an electric car for an entire day, and then I had to give it back at night. I got back into my rented gasoline car, and my first 15 minutes, I was sort of sitting there going, God, this car is noisy, and it's making all these strange sounds. The engine is rising and falling, the transmission is shifting. You don't have any of that with an electric car.
So modern electric cars are a pleasure to drive, cost little to run, reduce environmental impact, and can be driven unlimited distances. In their efforts to reduce emissions, governments are at last legislating to encourage the installation of tens of thousands of charging points in homes, on streets, and all across the highway network. Is it possible, after 100 years in the shade, that the EV is about to have its day in the sun?
There's a lot of reasons why it should succeed now at a level that it never succeeded at before. Now, when people are spending $100 or $200 to fill their tanks, that's a lot of pain at the pumps. It's driving a lot of this.
L'idée, c'est vraiment de créer un marché de masse. C'est-à-dire qu'on va acheter une voiture électrique, non seulement parce qu'on a une sensibilité environnementale, mais surtout parce que c'est mieux pour son porte-monnaie.
This time, I'm convinced that the evolution, the slow evolution to electric cars is with us. It's a permanent part of the auto industry, and it's going to stay.
By 2020, we should see some significant market penetration. I don't think by then there'll be no gas cars on the road. It's like that mix in 1910 where you still had horses on the road.
The great American, archetype is of the hot rodder in his garage, taking the flathead forward and making it go faster. And electric cars will play to the new generation's strength in all things computer, and they will be able to add power and speed, and they will be the new hot rodders.
In 1912, the first generation of EVs began their decline into obscurity. 100 years later, with renewable energy and battery innovations arriving, plus manufacturers such as Renault pushing back the boundaries, it seems everything just might be leading us towards another electric revolution.
The kid who's 4 today, by the time he or she is in his or her 20s and buying their first car, they will have a choice of plug-in vehicles as well as gasoline cars. And their kids, it might be 50-50. Not going to happen next year, but what we're seeing now is the earliest members of the revolution putting the earliest soldiers in the showrooms.